No, today we'll have Bob Robert Gomulkiewicz, right? Or Professor G, as I heard his students refer to him, talking about sort of openness in intellectual property, in particular in copyright. And Bob has been here with us as a CIPIL scholar for the whole of this month, and I understand you're staying on for most of November as well. So if you guys want to sort of catch up with him, you got another couple of weeks to do so. And with that, I think I just hand over to you, and we'll hear from you, and then we'll discuss, right?
Great, thank you. Well, let me just start by saying thank you to Henning and to Lionel for hosting me here as a visiting scholar. You've just been very warm hosts and very, very helpful for me as I have dug in to try to do a project on legal history, which is new for me, although I'm going to try to weave a bit of it in here tonight just to please my colleague Lionel Bentley, who is really the person who is the expert in the room. But I do think that the history of copyright is relevant to what I'm going to talk about tonight, even though in some ways what I'm talking about tonight is very cutting edge. So I have two objectives for tonight's seminar. First, I want to explore the role that law plays in the innovative process. And in particular, I want to explore how the law plays a role in what we call open innovation, because a lot of people are talking about open innovation. There's a lot of good buzz around open innovation as a development activity. And so if you think about it and you think about that word open, that word might lead you to believe that law plays no role in the innovative process. Or in fact, it might lead you to believe that law actually impedes the development process. And to me, the best way to summarize this is to borrow a title from one of the best copyright scholars in the world, Jane Ginsburg, who has been a visiting scholar here many times. She wrote this great article called "How Copyright Law Got a Bad Name for Itself." And so I think that captures this concern that somehow the law impedes innovation. But what I want to do tonight, using open source software as a case study, is to show you how actually law plays an important, even a vital role in innovation and the innovative process. And in particular, how intellectual property law plays a vital role and contract law plays a vital role in that innovative process. Now, you might think that if you, again, ponder this word innovation, that it's just as simple as putting something into the public domain, that that's really what openness is about. But as I discovered when I got involved in the University of Washington's decision to create open access for its scholarly works, things are not quite so simple. Because yes, scholars are interested in allowing open access to their scholarly works, but they have caveats. Yes, I will allow open access if I get attribution. Yes, I will allow open access if nobody can modify or create derivative works of my scholarly work. Yes, I'm in favor of open access if nobody can commercialize my works. Yes, I'm in favor of open access if nobody holds me liable for the contents of my works. So we might think then that openness is easy, but it's not. It's complicated. It's complicated from a legal standpoint. And that takes me to my second objective, which is to try to identify the role that lawyers play in the innovative process. And I want to talk about the role that lawyers can do in playing a positive role in the innovative process. And to do that, I want to show how lawyers not only have to understand deeply intellectual property and contract law and policy, but I also want to show how it's important for lawyers to understand other things about the innovative process, how it's important for them to understand technology, how it's important for them to understand business practices and business models, and how important even to understand cultural norms in the environment that they're working in. So yes, I'm going to talk about law tonight for sure, but I'm also going to talk about these other things, because these other things are critical for lawyers to play a positive role in the innovative process. So here's my agenda for us tonight. First, we're going to start off by defining some terms. Let's talk about what is open source software, and then who makes it, and how is it actually developed. And then, after we set that basic framework, then we're going to move into a discussion about the law. How does law fit into the picture? How does law play in the open source software movement? And then we'll drill down in particular on how intellectual property law plays a role in the open source movement, and then look at contract law as well. And then finally, I want to identify two particular types of what I call copyright licensing for revolutionaries, which illustrate, I think, in a very powerful way, the role that law can play in open innovation. And I'm going to talk about a famous open source license called the General Public License, and then a collection of licenses called permissive licenses as examples of how the law can play a really powerful role in open innovation. And then I'm going to finish with a few concluding observations. Okay, so let's define some terms first. And to do that, you have to be an expert in software technology. How many people are an expert in software technology? Yeah, okay. But don't worry, I can make the rest of you an expert in 1 minute through my tried and true software development lesson, okay? So are you with me? Just stay with me for 1 minute. Okay, software comes in three basic forms. When a programmer writes software, they write it in a form called source code. And anybody who is proficient in the particular language that they're writing in, C or Java or Cobalt, they can understand that source code. So that is the code created by programmers. Okay, you with me? Once you have created your source code, then you run that source code through a tool called a compiler. And that compiler creates object code. And that object code is what is running on your computer. So several of you have PCs running right now. You're running object code. It's machine-readable code. It's what's actually executing on your computer. No human can understand it. It's only understandable by a machine. And then the third type, the third way to understand software is by visual displays. As that object code is running on your system, it's displaying different things on your screen. And that is a separate way to think about software, is through visual displays. So, are you all with me? Okay. So when we talk about open source, we're talking about software in its source code form, okay? So that's what source means in open source. What about open? Openness refers to certain freedoms. Freedom to view that source code, to see what it's actually doing, to run the software for any purpose, and then critically to modify that software in any way that the programmer wants, and then to be able to distribute the underlying software and any modifications in any way that they want. And so these principles of openness are drawn from two critical definitions: the open source definition that's created by an organization called the Open Source Initiative, and the free software definition that's created by the Free Software Foundation. And I'll have a little bit more to say about those organizations as I move forward. Now, there are other names that you might have heard for open source software: community software, public software, and then another name that probably is most prominent is free software. And here we mean free as in freedom, not as in price. And I'll have more to say about that later. But there is a controversy that's raging among programmers. If you were a programmer and you listened to the first part of my talk, you might be incensed at my use of the word open, because people in the free software community think that you should use the word free because it captures the religious zeal that you should have when you do this type of programming. So I don't want to offend anybody here tonight, and so I'm just going to, just to show you how passionate some people can get about this distinction between open and free, I give you a quote from one of the luminaries in the open source movement, Richard Stallman. Free software is the only ethically satisfactory form of software development. And so, just so I don't offend anybody tonight, I'm going to use the politically correct term FOSS, free and open source software. So I'm going to try to be really inclusive so nobody jumps down my throat during my talk. Okay. So you may be asking yourself, doesn't everybody use open source? Well, no, most companies that actually put software out there into the world don't use the open source software method. So I would say that most conventional software is not open source. And so what's the contrast? The contrast is that most conventional software actually holds that source code as a trade secret. And then secondly, when they distribute their software, they're not distributing the instructions that the programmers can understand. They're only distributing the object code version. And then thirdly, there are limited derivative works rights. Some conventional software companies give you derivative works rights, but very limited. And so this type of licensing, rather than called open source, comes with other names like end user license, click wrap, shrink wrap. Many of you have heard those terms. You may have also heard the terms non-free and closed. That's what people in the open source community would say, because they want to show, using rhetoric, that this conventional software is somehow damaged goods in their mind. It's less ethically pure than open source or free software. So you'll hear them call these things closed source. I think the better term is binary use software. I've tried in my scholarship to introduce that term because I think it more accurately reflects in a non-ideological way the difference, but I'm the only one that's adopted it so far. Feel free to adopt it and join me on that bandwagon. Okay, so who actually makes this kind of software? Well, it really is made by these amazing programmers who have a passion for creating great code that call themselves hackers. Now, when you think of hackers, you think of people that break in to networks or steal credit card information. But open source software developers don't like that use of the word hacker. They call those kind of people crackers, people that crack into networks. And so they like to call themselves hackers, which just means people that like to tinker with code, that just enjoy the process of developing software. And when we think about good examples of that, I've listed 3 people who we think of as sort of the classic hackers. One I've already mentioned is Richard Stallman, who created the Free Software Foundation. But another important one is Eric Raymond, who really is one of the people who came up with this terminology of open source to be less confrontational and to try to get open source really adopted in the business community. He's also written some really interesting papers. I gave you a couple of them. The Cathedral and the Bazaar is probably the most famous, explaining the sociology of what he calls the hacker tribe. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about this community, or the tribe as he calls it, I would read those papers. And then, of course, Linus Torvalds, who's probably the most famous open source hacker because he's created the most popular, you might say the most successful open source product called Linux. So how is this kind of software developed? Well, Eric Raymond likes to say by scratching an itch. In other words, by seeing a problem that needs to be solved. Engineers like to solve problems. They think that's fun. They think that's interesting. My dad was an electrical engineer, and when he retired, the best day of his week was when his computer broke. Right? And then he could call up Hewlett-Packard to discuss a possible fix, who would then usually refer him to Microsoft, and so he'd get on the phone with people at Microsoft to try to figure out a fix, and then he would invite another one of his retired engineer buddies over to discuss other ways to fix it. They had the time of their lives. Right? And that's the mood, that's the sentiment of an open source hacker. And so they see a problem that they want to fix, and they scratch that itch. Now, how is this done? It's done through collaborative development. And so that's one of the things that makes this very powerful, because so many people are participating in the process of identifying defects in the software. Eric Raymond likes to say, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, which is just another way of saying that through this collaborative development process, you can create very high quality software. Now, that gives us a little bit of a feel of democracy, but on the other hand, the open source movement has a strong sense of autocracy, because the way the process actually works is one hacker writes some code, and then post it on the internet for anybody to see. And people contribute all sorts of possible changes to that code. But yet, it's the open source hacker that gets to decide whether to incorporate any of those changes into the underlying product. And so in that sense, it's very autocratic, because the open source hacker gets to pick and choose which contributions it wants to put into the development. And sometimes this is done through one trusted individual, such as in Linux, where it's Linus Torvalds. And in other cases, it's through a group, such as in the Apache project, where they have a whole democratic process for voting on which developments actually get incorporated into the development. Now, sometimes, though, there is a controversy about whether something should go in or something should go out. Sometimes people disagree with the autocrat's decision. And when that's true, then one group of hackers can go off and start a competing project. And this is called forking. And so this is something that happens from time to time in the open source community. And so sometimes then you have two competing projects that are out there vying for attention of programmers, and that's called forking. Okay, so who uses this kind of code? Well, I think it's fair to say that almost everybody is using open source software. Many of you don't know that you're using it. Open source software has always been part of the backbone of the internet. Apache has been a popular web server for a long time. SendMail has been a popular router of email. And more, we see that Linux is on many, many types of computers and lots of different types of devices. And so Linux is everywhere, even if you don't know that you're using Linux. And so I think it's fair to say that lots of businesses, Amazon, Apple, Google, IBM, Intel, all are using open source software. And so are governments. Many governments are very keen on using open source software, including the United States government. Who doesn't use it much yet? And I say yet because I think the momentum is continuing to build for use of open source really for everybody. But it's not particularly user-friendly most of the time, so most people aren't using it on their desktop. And some people are a little bit worried about trusting software created by a loose group of hackers. And some people are worried about being sued for IP infringement, particularly patent infringement. And so some of those people are a little bit leery. But I say yet because there's great momentum behind open source. So we might think that when we hear this word open or we think of this word free, that people can't make any money off of free and open source software. But even Richard Stallman likes to say that hackers have to eat too. And so there are lots and lots of businesses that have figured out how to do very, very well in the business of open source. And I've just identified a long list, more than I expect you to read on this slide. But some of the most popular ones are branded distributions, and many of you have heard of Red Hat, which has branded distributions of Linux. Selling services is a really important way to make money off of open source. Selling hardware that is based on open source is also a very popular way to make money off of open source. And I'd say probably the most popular way to make money off of open source of late is selling advertising, and that is what Facebook and Google are doing. They'll give you a device, or a device will be optimized using open source, and they're happy for you to have that device for free or for cost of goods because they're going to make their money through advertising. So again, when you think of free speech, not free beer, as Richard Stallman likes to say. Okay, so that's enough background now. Let's turn to this question of the law's role in creating free and open source software. And where we have to begin is with this fundamental premise that software is protectable by all forms of intellectual property. It's protectable by trade secrets, it's protectable by trademarks, it's protectable by patents in some situations, and fundamentally it's protected by copyright law. So we know that when we say legal protection for software, we know we have to contend with all these forms of intellectual property protection. And so that really leads us to this core question: is intellectual property protection incongruent with free and open source software, as some people might believe? So I think it's fair to say there is some evidence of incongruence. And let's start with trade secrets. The basic philosophy of open source development is that nobody gets to protect their source code as a trade secret. So in that sense, it is true that trade secret protection is definitely incongruent with open source. And what about patents? If you read a lot of the writings of Richard Stallman, or even the preamble to the General Public License, which we're going to discuss in great detail in just a little while, you'll see that Richard Stallman believes that patent protection is the enemy of freedom, is the enemy of open source software and free and open source software. Now, I question that, actually. I was a visiting scholar at Oxford 10 years ago, and I gave a talk called Foss and Its Fear of Patents. And so this is my incredibly quick summary of that entire hour-long talk. But basically, my bottom line was there's nothing to fear but fear itself, to borrow from Winston Churchill. Because, as it turns out, all these large companies that are making money off of open source have come to the protection of open source software. And I gave you a couple of different patent licensing pools that have been organized to try to protect the development and use of open source software. One is the Open Invention Network, and another, the License on Transfer Network. There are others as well, but I just highlight those. And I highlight those because one of the companies that was assumed to be an arch nemesis of open source software, my former employer, Microsoft, has actually joined both of these organizations. Right? So Microsoft, you might say, has gone from being a hater of open source, right, to being somebody who has actually now come to the aid of protecting open source. They have done it in other ways as well, but it's been very dramatic just in the last few weeks that they have joined in these patent pool networks. In fact, I even had to laugh because the announcement was made by a person who I hired into the legal department. So that just made me chuckle. Okay, so I gave you a couple pieces of evidence of incongruence, but now let me turn to the fact that I think that intellectual property is congruent with open source. And the first place we see congruence is in the use of trademarks. Hackers, just as well as users and vendors of conventional software, use trademarks. And I just gave you some pictures of some very prominent trademarks used in the open source movement. The GNU is actually the trademark of the Free Software Foundation, so even the most radical organization has a trademark. I don't know if this is true, but in my mind I have Richard Stallman hand drawing this as a pencil sketch. May or may not be true. Then we have the mascot for Linux, which is a cute little penguin. I think his name is Tux, if I have that right. And then Red Hat has its own logo that it uses for its branded distribution. And then there's also a famous certification mark that certifies when you write a license and use a license that meets the open source principles that I outlined early in my talk. And in fact, I wrote my own open source license called the Simple Public License, and I put it through the certification process, and my open source license is OSI certified. So I get to use that particular trademark of the open source movement. Okay. I think the strongest evidence of congruence, though, has to do with copyright licensing. As I mentioned, copyright protects source code, object code, and visual displays. And so that is our starting point. But it's really contract in conjunction with copyright that allows productive use, and I would even say innovative use of copyrighted works. So it's really this idea of copyright plus contract that equals licensing that really creates this power, the powerful use of law in furtherance of openness and furtherance of freedom. And so don't just take my word for it. I gave you a quote from one of the groups that has a distribution of Linux, the Debian GNU Linux group, and they say to stay free, software must be copyrighted and licensed. So they also have this awareness that copyright and contract is important to their work. Okay, let me try to explain why I think this is so. And to do that, I have to give you a primer on licensing. So if you want the longer version, you can come to the University of Washington in the spring and take an entire course from me on intellectual property licensing. But tonight, you can get my 1-minute licensing course. Okay. So why do you need to license? And the first reason has to do with what I mentioned already, is that we have intellectual property protection on software. All types of intellectual property protect software. And because of that, then you need to give permission to use that copyrighted work. And so that's what licensing is. It's really intellectual property in action. It's doing something productive with your intellectual property. I was invited to give a lecture to the copyright class my first year at the University of Washington on copyright licensing. And I thought I would do something funny. And so I stood up and I told the class that they were wasting their time taking this class. I said, you should be taking a class on copyright licensing, because that is where the action is. Because you don't really need to give any copyright holder advice on how to get a copyright. Once the work is fixed in a tangible medium of expression, they have a copyright. End of story. And so you should be spending your time learning about copyright licensing. It's that important. Well, that professor never invited me back to give a lecture in her class again, and I was overstating the point, of course. But the point is, it's all fine to hold an intellectual property right, but the real question is, what are you doing with it? What productive use are you making of it? And that's where contract law comes in. That's where licensing comes in. And so why license, right? Why use contract with intellectual property and copyright in particular? Well, there are many reasons for that. Because contract allows the intellectual property lots of flexibility in the ways that they can use their copyrighted work. It allows for lots of control and choice. Now, I put choice in because most of the time when people use the word control, they don't mean that with a very positive connotation. So I think a better way to think about it is the copyright holder having lots of choices of things to do with their copyrighted work. It enables sharing and collaboration, various packages of rights, various price points. And so let me try to summarize this in just a few slides. And what I'm really trying to say in a nutshell is that licensing really enables two types of innovation: technological innovation and business model innovation. And let me just tell you what I mean by that. When we talk about technological innovation, we talk about building products, making software, and creating solutions for customers with our software. So if you think about Windows and you think about Linux, let's start with Windows. Bill Gates did not write every line of Windows. Neither did David Cutler. I gave you a picture of David Cutler, one of my former clients at Microsoft, who is probably the father of writing the modern version of Windows. But as amazing of a programmer as David Cutler is, he didn't write every line of code. You might be amazed to know that Microsoft Windows includes hundreds of thousands of lines of code from lots of third parties, right? So for Windows to be a product, right, Microsoft had to license hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of lines of code from other developers. So to build Windows, Microsoft had to use licensing. And the same is true of Linux. Linus Torvalds may have written some of the original code in Linux, although he didn't start from scratch either. And he now views himself more as a program manager, accepting contributions from lots and lots of people. So if you look at Linux, you see that Linux contains hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code from other collaborators. So to just build Linux requires licensing. Licensing is the tool that allows you to build an innovative software product. Without licensing, your product can't be as feature rich, it can't be as robust. And what about creating customer solutions? We just take for granted, if we have a PC that says Dell or Apple on it, we think that perhaps Dell or Apple has created every component in that personal computer. But when you think about it a little bit more, you know that's not the case. And in fact, there is technology from so many different companies that have to come together for that personal computer to work. I just tried to give you a little picture of that. And so the way that these companies all come together to make this customer solution work is through intellectual property licensing. They're licensing trade secrets, they're licensing patents perhaps, but for sure they're licensing copyrights. And so it's really licensing that allows this kind of upstream product building innovation. Licensing also plays an important role in what I call business model innovation, taking products to market in lots of innovative ways. We can now get software in so many different forms and so many different methods. It used to be we had to go to a retail store or the software was pre-installed on our computer through what we call the OEM or VAR channel. But now you can download software, it can be streamed to you, and all of these different ways of distributing software are based on intellectual property licensing. On top of that, we also use licenses to enable use in different ways, to create different packages of rights at different price points to cater to different markets. And so that's why I like to say that licensing really is at the heart of this type of business model innovation in the information economy. Okay, well, some people might be saying, Bob, that all sounds really good, but what's the catch? What's the catch? And there is a catch. And in fact, scholars are constantly pointing out the catch. And their concern is that intellectual property protection provides control, but if you combine intellectual property protection with contract, then you have far too much control. And so if you read the law review literature, you would think that the story that I told, the rosy use of licensing, is actually a dark and foreboding story. But I have to say that the scholars have some good points, right? And we have to really try to keep a balanced view of both the positive things about licensing, but also ways that it can be abused. So I don't want you to think that this rosy story that I told is the whole story. There still always has to be concerns about the control or too much control that you can get with IP protection for sure, but in particular IP protection plus contract. So sort of based on those fears of scholars, when I was starting to get active as a lawyer and then became an academic in the 1990s and moving into the 2000s, there was a lot of fear based on these concerns that scholars have raised that dominant firms, including my former client, Microsoft, would use copyright licensing to really squeeze out innovative new firms. And so that was the narrative. That was the concern. Now, I think that didn't turn out to be the case. Right? When you look at what has happened, the realities starting in the 2000s, we see that innovative new firms, and in some cases some old firms, were actually able to use licensing to unseat some of the dominant firms of the 1990s. And so to try to give you a sense of that, now I'm going to turn to what I'm calling copyright licensing for revolutionaries. I want to dig more deeply into what's going on in the free and open source software movement and talk about some of the legal tools that they're using so that I can hopefully illustrate this to you. So let's start with a license called the General Public License. This license was not written by a lawyer. This license was written by Richard Stallman. Apparently he had a little bit of help from lawyers, but if you know Richard Stallman, he probably didn't listen to every piece of advice he was given. And some people actually have said that the drafting of this license is Richard Stallman's greatest accomplishment, even a greater accomplishment than some of the amazing software that he's written. And some people really refer to this license not just as a contract document, but call it the constitution of the free software movement. And so that's why I have it enable software development by the people and of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is a quote from the Free Software Foundation's website. Okay, so that's how much they care about this license. That is how central it is to what they're trying to accomplish, not just as a software development method, but also, as Stallman likes to say, as a political movement or a social movement. Okay, but since we're lawyers, let's get into the details. So let's look at the key terms of that general public license. And how, in other words, how is it using contract plus copyright? And the way it's using contract is by a term in the general public license that requires anybody who creates a derivative work to share and share alike. In other words, to allow anybody else to modify that software continuing on forever and ever and ever. And the only way that you can enforce that obligation to, or that right to continually allow derivative works is through contract. Right? Its contract is creating that level of choice, or it's enabling that, what Richard Stallman would call social virtue. Some people call this viral derivative works, but I like to call it share and share alike. But the share and share alike is being enforced with the control that copyright gives you and the control that contract gives you as well. Another important feature of the general public license, maybe not as prominent as the share and share alike provision, is that you need to document changes to the code. And the reason that I point this out is that for those of you who are copyright students in the room, you know that in continental copyright law, there's this notion of moral rights, this strong notion of moral rights that your software is not just a utilitarian work, it also represents you as a person. And so by documenting the code, you're actually showing people how you have changed that work. So that your changes aren't attributed to the original author. So it's an attempt by contract to try to do the work of moral rights. And so I think that's kind of a remarkable thing and really is right at the heart of what copyright is trying to do. And then finally, no warranties. So Richard Stallman and other hackers believe that they are making an important contribution to society, and as such, they don't want to be held liable for that in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's look at another set of licenses that I will also call licensing for revolutionaries, what some people call permissive or some people call academic licenses. And I'm just gonna, I just highlighted three of them. One is the BSD or Berkeley software distribution license, the Apache license, and the artistic license. And so these are rival licenses to the general public license. And the way this will come into your life as a lawyer is your client may come in and say, what open source license should I use? Should I use the general public license or should I use one of these permissive licenses? And so you as a lawyer need to be well versed in these core terms of the license because your client's decision will turn on the different business models that are represented by these licenses. Okay, so let's look at the key terms of these permissive licenses. The first one is you can do anything with the software. So the three licenses that I had in my prior slide all phrase this in a slightly different way. But if I were creating a simple language version of the license grant, it would be this. You can do anything with the software. And the reason this is different than the general public license is you can take that software under permissive license and put it into conventional software and not share and share alike. So you can choose whether you want to share and share alike. You may, but you don't have to. It's your choice. You can use that software literally in any way that you want. Secondly, these licenses tend to really strongly require attribution. Again, this is about moral rights. Attribution is one of the continental moral rights. United States has very weak moral rights protection, so it's using contract law, these licenses are using contract law to do the work of moral rights. And then thirdly, and this is exactly the same as in the open source or the general public license, there are no warranties or liability because the hacker is making a contribution to society. So those are the terms. Okay, well, you may think that these are just simple license terms, but for hackers, there's something deeper going on here. They really see these two licenses as representing two fundamentally different ideas of freedom. Right? The GNU General Public License is saying that if you use GPL license code, you have a moral obligation to share alike, and that is enforced with the contract. Whereas the people who believe in the permissive licenses say, no, if you want to share alike, you can share alike. Right? It's up to you. If you want to take the code and put it into a proprietary product, that is your choice. And so if you have a client who comes into your office and asks you whether they should use the general public license or permissive license, you don't just have to give them legal advice. You don't just have to understand the technology. You have to understand these cultural norms of the free and open source software movement. Because a lot of times the choice that the programmer will make will be deeply influenced by the signaling effect of those licenses, signaling these two different visions of freedom. This is disconcerting to my law students. Right? Why can't the programmers just pick the license that fits their business model? Right? But it's not that simple. Right? These deep cultural norms play very strongly in the choice of licenses that are picked by hackers. Okay, so let me finish with three concluding observations about the free and open source software movement and what we can learn from that movement, and then I'll open it up to questions. I think for me, and this struck me in the first article I wrote about open source software back in 1999, is that FOSS, the free and open source software movement, and conventional companies that use binary use software, they're using exactly the same legal tools. They're both using copyright plus contract. Maybe that doesn't seem like such a radical idea now, but back in 1999, most people assumed that open source was about public domain, about putting things into the public domain. And so one of the things that I tried to do in my early scholarship is show that actually they're using the same legal tools. Open source and BUS are using the same legal tools. They're just using them for different objectives. So everybody loves licensing. Everybody. Okay, my second observation. As I referenced, a lot of scholars remind us that we should be wary about intellectual property licensing because it can give too much control to intellectual property holders. But as we discuss licensing and we think about the right policies that we should put in place to address licensing, I think free and open source software is a valuable lens to think about those policy decisions. Because it's one thing to think about licensing through the lens of making sure that Microsoft doesn't get out of hand, or Google doesn't get out of hand, or IBM doesn't get out of hand. But at the same time, we need to think about licensing that's done by people like Richard Stallman or Linus Torvalds. And so I think it gives us a more balanced way of thinking about some really key concerns as we're formulating policy around licensing, where we're talking about freedom and certainty of contract or balance in intellectual property laws. I think looking at licensing through the lens of FOSS gives us a more nuanced look into the kind of policies that we should put into place when governments are trying to regulate licensing, or not. And then finally, and this is my bow to Lionel Bentley, I think it's fair to say that copyright licensing for revolutionaries is not new at all. It's not new at all. When I was at Oxford, I was trying to find the origins of the term licensing that was used in the way that we use it now to refer to copyright plus contract, and I wasn't successful. I wasn't successful in finding that. But I had this awareness, though, that contract is older than copyright law itself. Right? So I used to tell my students, licensing is as old as intellectual property because it's mentioned in the Venetian Patent Act. Right? So we know that people were using the word licensing as early as the Venetian Patent Act. But then all of a sudden I started realizing that that was way too modest. Right? Contract existed before intellectual property. And people were using contract to structure their relationships around copyrighted work, what we now call copyrighted works, long before there was anything that we know as copyright law. So that's the first thing to understand, is that really contract has been around long before intellectual property and has allowed people to do productive things with works of authorship long before we had copyright law. And then the second point I want to make, and this I really have Lionel Bentley to thank for, is that when you read Lionel's work, and not just Lionel, but other scholars as well, you see that even though we think that copyright law in England began with the Statute of Anne in 1710, we see that people didn't really understand how that law worked. And Lionel's work and others really points out that even though England had a copyright law, how it worked was quite uncertain at the time. And really that uncertainty went on for definitely for decades, right? Definitely for decades. And so my takeaway from looking at that history is to really reflect on what it was like for me as a new lawyer when I graduated from law school in 1987. And the same thing was true. We didn't know how copyright law worked as it related to software. There was a lot of uncertainty. Not that there was a copyright law, but how it applied to this new technology that we called software. So in 1710, there was uncertainty about how copyright law applied. In 1987, there was uncertainty about how copyright law applied. So how did parties do productive things, right, in the shadow of this uncertainty, right? And the way they did productive things is by using contracts, right, by using licenses. So really, it's contracts that carried on and continue to carry on when we have uncertainty about copyright law. And so I think that is one of the reasons why contract is such a powerful part of the story if we want to understand what's going on the ground for using works of authorship. And let me just give you some examples of that from what I'll call some of the early copyright licensing revolutionaries. And one example is Alexander Pope. He didn't just assign his copyright to publishers, although he did that sometimes, but he and his publishers worked on innovative ways to get his works out into the market through subscriptions, right? And so he is one of the ones, not the only one, but others did this as well. They didn't just sell individual copies, they had subscriptions for some of his works. And so that is an innovative use of contract with the intellectual property work. Charles Dickens, I think, is another interesting example. I read something recently that in the later years of his life, after complaining bitterly that many of his works were pirated in the United States, which I think is obviously true, he went to the United States kind of after he was so well known, in part because of his pirated works, and he made as much money on one tour of public speaking and reading his works in public, a public performance of his work. He made more money doing that than he had over the many years of selling copies of his work. So again, a different kind of business model for Charles Dickens. And finally, let me conclude with Brazoban Aylmer, who is what I might call the original free software developer. Well, not software, right? Free book developer. If you read some of the contracts that Lionel has uncovered in the Upcott collection in the British Library, and others have uncovered in other places, you'll see that they would often allow booksellers to give away copies of their works for charity, right? So a lot of the works that were published had to do with manners or about morals or about good living. And some of the publishers would allow their booksellers to give away those works for free, as long as it was done for charity. So you might say free beer and free speech, or free beer instead of free speech, right? But they're using contract law to allow different price points depending upon the use. So this is simple, but it is another good example of how people for a long time, these copyright revolutionaries, have been doing free software licensing from around the time of the Statute of Anne. Okay, I will open it up for questions now.